Assalamu alaikum. Hello everybody. This will be our next lecture or the second lecture in our course poetry. And let's do a quick recap for the previous lecture and the things we addressed in the first lecture. First of all, we talked about poetry, and mainly we talked about tried to answer the question, what is poetry? And mainly we were talking about poetry, as poetry is perceived as fictional, use specialized language, lacks pragmatic function, and ambiguous. And I believe that we talked about and detailed some good information about the four main features that are found in this definition as fictional, which is imaginative, not real, poetic language as the use of special language, pragmatic function, and we dedicated much focus for this pragmatic function and the lack of the pragmatic function, which later on will be directly connected with the subjectivity and the fictional fact of poetry and ambiguity. Then we talked about some indicators, some signs, some indicators that might indicate or might give us an idea that the text we are having is poetry, that a specific text is verse, not prose. And we were talking about three main points here. First of all, we were talking about the layout. And when we talked about the layout, for example, we talked about an example like this form. This text takes the form of a paragraph. This text takes the form of a paragraph. So the layout of such a text is not poetry. It is prose. It is more than like takes the form or the layout of prose. But when we look into the second part, this one, sorry. And when we're talking about the second part, this one, which does not take the form of a paragraph, still it takes the form of disconnected lines, uncompleted lines, just lines. We can say that this is poetry. This is poetry. The second thing that followed the layout of the of a poem, we talked about the language. Which we mainly were focusing on the intensive use of specialized language due to the relative shortness of a poem. Besides, in the main topic of under the umbrella of language, we talked about the short space that is allowed for poetry, and this short space doesn't have any specific criteria. It is relative. It is something approximate. We might find poems that are between 10 to 13 to 14 lines, and we might find poems that can extend to 100 lines and or thousands of lines. Okay. Besides, when we talked about the language, we talked about the overstructuring of the poetic language, or the language that is used in poetry. And this overstructuring will be the main focus during our analysis in the later on poems we're going to discuss. The third thing that we talked about is subjectivity, and we differentiated between subjectivity and objectivity. Subjectivity that is mainly based on a personal experience. Subjectivity that is mainly based on personal experience. When we talk about poetry, we do not talk about science facts. We don't say that 1 + 1 = 2, or when you boil water, it evaporates. In this form, or in this case, in such cases, we're talking about facts. We're talking about being objectivity. But mainly poetry reflects a personal experience or the human experience that is based on the personality, the personal perception about an event or a situation. Regardless such facts or such features or indicators about poetry, still we cannot say that we have a concise and precise definition. We cannot find or cannot have an inclusive and exclusive definition for poetry. And we talked about two examples of Arabic poetry, one from the old Arabic poetry and one from the modern Arabic poetry. For example, when we see the first example here, تموت الأسد في الغابات جوعا ولحم الضأن تأكله الكلاب وعبد قد ينام على حرير وذو نسب مفارشه التراب. Mainly when we talk about the first example here, we're talking about poetry that is mainly based on the layout that is mainly consists of two parts, الشطر والقفل. We're talking about clear rhyme and rhythm for the Arabic English poetry. But after the Renaissance or the Arabic Nahda, and due to the interaction between the Arab intellectuals and the Western world, Arabic poetry started to take different forms. And the below form is part of a poem for Mahmoud Darwish. نلتقي بعد قليل بعد عام بعد عامين وجيل ورمت في آلة التصوير 20 دقيقة وعصافير الجليد. Here in such example, you can find the rhyme and the rhythm and the rhythm that can be traced in verses of the Old English, of our Old Arabic poetry. Still, we can say that both of them are poetry, okay? But they have differences. They have similarities, but they have, in addition to that, major differences. For example, when we talk about the rhyme and the rhythm, it's basically clear and traced in the first example. Ba and ba, the lines ending with ba sound. But for Mahmoud Darwish, for example, we cannot say that we have consistent rhyme for the lines or the words of Mahmoud Darwish. But mainly such new forms of Arabic poetry is based on internal beat or التفعيلة الشعر أو التفعيلة الداخلية للشعر. Based on that, we stopped here, I think, and we summarized some common features about the features of literature that might define or help us in defining what is poetry. And first of all, shortness, and we were talking about shortness relatively. It's not discrete. We don't have any clear foundation for the shortness. We cannot say that it is a poem cannot exceed 10 lines, 5 lines, 20 lines. We cannot say that, but relative shortness, dense expressions as a result of the short and the narrow space that is allowed for the poet. So a poet usually tends to say a lot of things in a narrow space or in a limited number of words. Expressing subjectivity, we've talked about before, when we differentiate between subjectivity and objectivity. The musical being of a poem or the song like of the poem that is one of the most distinctive things that distinguishes poetry from any other literary genres as plays, drama, or novels. The overstructuring, we're talking about phonologically, syntactically, and morphologically, deviating from everyday language. And again, we're referring to the subjectivity, which is aesthetics and self-reflection. Yeah. Now we're going to talk about the types of poetry. The types of poetry. And mainly we have three types of poetry. Okay. The first type of poetry we have is lyrical poetry or lyrical poems, narrative poetry, and descriptive and didactic poetry. First of all, when we talk about lyrical poetry, we have some common features that are basically shared with any other form of poetry. Shortness, as we said, as we said before, um, the single speaker, the attitude of the single speaker, or the subjectivity, which is like the second point is mainly derived from the subjective fact of poetry. What does it say? A single speaker presents a state of mind or an emotional state. What does that mean? And if we refer back to this point here, subjectivity, we were talking about what? We were talking about personal experience, an experience that is based on the person himself. We're not talking about some scientific facts or being objective. So here, another distinctive fact about poetry that distinguishes it from any other literary form is that poetry reflects a state of mind or an emotional state which is direct. Let's have an example about that from our daily life, from our experience as Palestinians. In 1948, the Palestinian people were uprooted from their homeland, Palestine, and that year uh, unleashed the still going Palestinian Nakba or catastrophe. Immediately after 1948 and the years followed, you can see some poems that are written that talk about Palestine, the catastrophe, and the suffering. But when we talk about novels, for example, the first Palestinian novel was written by Ghassan Kanafani after Nakba, okay, and it was written in 1963, Rijal fi Shams, or Men in the Sun. Now you can see how much time how much time does it take to write a novel. It's not the time itself. It's not the time itself, but it is the nature of of a novel. It doesn't describe an immediate emotional psychological status. Okay, facts or situations or subject matters that are addressed in a novel, in a way or another, have to be normalized, take a period of time in order to be elaborated, and events can be sequenced logically. But in poetry, you are angry, you can write a poem. You are happy, you can write a poem. You are sad, you can write a poem. It reflects a direct and immediate psychological and emotional status. The third point in lyrical poetry that we were talking about here as an example of the differences and the difficulty of having a definition for poetry is we're talking about the rhyme and the rhythm, for example, the endings here with ba sound, the lack of such endings in the modern poetry for Mahmoud Darwish. Such endings or such sounds that are corresponding mainly make it like shifts a poem to a musical ringing tone. And this is one of the reasons that is assumed that poetry is one of the reasons that poetry was the first literary genre, because people at the dawn of life didn't know writing, and if they knew writing, they lacked the equipment and the material to print and document that. And in order to memorize and to keep records in minds for some events, some people you want to keep their memories in your mind. Which is better for you, to learn by heart a paragraph or a song? The musicality of the song, okay, the ups and downs in the song makes it easier for a poem to be memorized and kept in mind, much more than a narrative form of text. Okay. Basically, when we talk about lyrical poetry, we talk about different types. We can talk about elegy, ode, sonnet, or dramatic monologue, and we're going to detail them in the following slides. When we say elegy, elegy, it has an equivalent in Arabic, which is الرثاء. I want to say something here, that it is not necessarily that each literary form in English has its equivalent in Arabic. In some cases we might have, in other cases we might not have. When we talk about elegy, we mainly talk about it's a poem that laments the death of something or someone. It can be a beloved, an important person, anything. It mainly holds or carries a sad tone, or another form that is Solomon mediation, تأملات. Okay, Solomon mediation or تأملات مرسلة. Mainly, we have, like, when we talk about elegy is mainly it holds a serious topic, a serious subject, for the mourning of the death of someone, or رثاء شخص ما أو شخص عزيز عليك. Now let us look into some examples of elegy, some examples of elegy in Arabic and in English. For example, the first part of this, which is parts of poems. And as the flames climbed high into the night, and to the light the sacrificial rite, I saw Saint laughing it with delight, the day the music died. Okay, this is the first example. And the second one, which is جرى دمعي فوق المحاجر وانهمر وحر غضا قد زاد في قلبي واشتعل وهد فؤادي وما أخبرت نعيه وضاق بالدنيا ودمعي قد هطل. Okay. For the Zoom meeting, I want you to look into the previous slide and highlight during the following discussion what are the lamenting features, what are the mournings, what are the griefs that are reflected in those two poems. You can Google it, you can find, you can search, you can do anything for the following, for the upcoming discussion. And we have two concepts in elegy. You need to differentiate and understand those two concepts: elegy and eulogy. Mainly, when we talk about elegy is a poem or a song. It takes the form of verse. Okay, and we talk about eulogy. It is an essay. It takes the form of prose. The second thing, the tone is sad. It takes the tone of remorse. And mainly the speaker or the poet, while writing an elegy, is lamenting the death of a person. While in eulogy, the tone is different, is praising. When you write an essay or a book about someone or something, in eulogy, you tend to praise and highlight the bravery or good deeds of a dead person. Now, generally speaking, when we talk about elegy, traditional elegy, and I'm talking about traditional elegy. Usually traditional elegy comprised of three main elements: lament, praise, and solace. Such structure, usually the traditional poem that laments somebody was used to start with lamenting the dead person, then praising the dead person, and solace. But after that, more recent and modern poems that of lament are no longer following such a clear structure, such a clear structure of an elegy. Now, let's have an example of an elegy that was written to lament the death of Abraham Lincoln. Okay, let us know. Um,
But oh heart, heart, heart. Oh the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. Here captain, dear father, this arm beneath your head, it is some dream that on the deck, you've fallen cold and dead. Exult O shores, and ring O bells. But I with mournful tread, walk the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead.
Now, in this poem, okay, this is the very early part of a long poem that laments the death of the death of Abraham Lincoln. From this or from those early parts or those early verses from the poem, you can see that the writer or the poet is starting the poem with lamenting the death of with lamenting the death of Abraham Lincoln. And how is that? And where is the features, or how is the lament traced in the presented verses? We're going to discuss that and talk about that in the Zoom meeting. The Zoom meeting. Okay. Now, the second part, or the second form, or the second example of the lyrical poetry is an ode.